Welcome to Talking Heads, episode 7. This is the classic episode in conjunction with the Bike Social virtual classic bike show. Sponsored this week by Abbas Security. A couple of weeks ago should have been the Stafford Classic Bike Show, and that, like a lot of things, has been postponed due to the coronavirus pandemic. So we decided to run a virtual classic bike show on Bike Social instead. We've got a couple of people here who are really interesting. Got really interesting to say about classic bikes. One of them is Chris Mayhew. Chris runs Lusso Veloce, a dealership in Leicestershire, which is kind of born out of what used to be North Leicester Motorcycles. North Leicester Motorcycles and Marini specialist. Chris will tell you more about that. Lusso Veloce is a kind of different kind of classic bike shop. And then we've got James Hewing, who is the director of the National Motorcycle Museum. And James used to be part of the VMCC, now runs the National Motorcycle Museum. If you haven't been to the National Motorcycle Museum, you really should go. It's just one of those places where a lot of us sort of think, oh, it's all British bikes, I'm not sure I'm interested in that. And then you go there and go, wow, this is just incredible. That's enough from me. You two guys, probably, do you want to just tell us a little bit more about what you do, who you are?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, well, I'm James Hewing. I'm Museum Director of the National Motorcycle Museum, which many of you will know is on Junction 6 of the M42 there, near Solihull, right across from the NEC. So we're easy to find if you've not been. And I'm formerly, as Steve said, I was 10 years as CEO of the VMCC Limited, the Vintage Motorcycle Club. So nearly 20 years now in the industry, as it were. 10 years at the VMCC and nearly 7 years now as Museum Director at the National Motorcycle Museum.
And Chris, do you want to tell us a bit more about your background? How you got it?
Well, as you said, I've taken over North Leicester Motorcycles, which was my father's business essentially for the last 47 years. When I took it over, we rebranded to Lusso Veloce, which seemed like a good idea. I can speak Italian, so it was easy for me, but most people struggle with it. But sort of North Leicester didn't really say Italian exotic, which is what we do. And so I wanted to kind of rebrand the business and move it forward, hence the name change. And plus the fact I wanted to introduce more stuff than just Marinis and Guzzies like we used to do. I do lots of race bikes now, top-end Ducatis, and some sort of chunkier stuff. And for those of you who haven't been since we've changed, we've done a lot of work. I'm now sat upstairs. We've got 2 floors of showroom where we used to have just the one downstairs, and so we've kind of doubled our capacity. And a lot of stuff has changed since I've taken over.
Yeah, and North Leicester used to be known, didn't it, as kind of a real sort of Marini specialist. But I think as well as that, I mean, at various times, just the time I've been kind of dealing with you guys, you've also had, I think, did you have Bimotor for a while? And
we were the Bimotor importer for a while, yeah. And I actually ended up going over to Italy and working at Bimotor for several years, trying to help them sort out their bikes, because the bikes they were sending across to us weren't good enough, basically. Which was sort of a really interesting time for me. I didn't speak Italian at the time, and I was in my early 20s, thought I knew everything, and so got in my van with my stuff and moved to Italy.
That must have been interesting. So when was that the kind of when there were still mostly Suzukis?
Yes, I went 2002, 2003. We were working on the SB8K Gobert. And I did all the development on the DB5 and some on the DB6. But there were sort of 6 of us worked at Bimotor at the time. So I was van driver, floor sweeper, development rider, production engineer. You name it, we did it. But I worked with some amazing people and I learnt so much. And it was a really interesting time. I did have hair before I moved to Italy and worked at Bimotor, and it was hugely frustrating because I was massively passionate, wanted to build something which I thought deserved to have Bimotor on the tank, and at the time they were happy just to build something. which for me was really, really frustrating. But it's you live and you learn.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens with the Kawasaki tie-up now, I guess, what comes out of that.
I think Kawasaki have done that just to give them some flexibility in order to carry on winning World Superbikes. If they build something with Bimotor Kawasaki on the tank, or then they only have to build a few of them, and they've got more flexibility with design. And what they'll probably do is have like a design office in Italy to style the Japanese stuff or something like that. I don't think they'll produce Bimotors as a company to try and sell motorbikes, will they? They'll just use it to bend the rules, I should think. Interesting idea. I think it's and James, you're unusual in the classic. But when I first met you, probably 10 years ago, you were kind of unusual in that you were the only person I know in the classic bike scene who owned a Suzuki TL1000. I think it was, wasn't it?
No, never had a TL, Steve.
Was it not a TL? What was it you had then?
No, never wanted to kill myself with that suspension, So.
What is it? I thought you had a TL1000. What did you have? I'm sure you had some kind of crazy Japanese bike at the time.
Going back then, those days, Speed Triple. Yeah, early Hinckley Speed Triple. Yeah, that would. Trying to think back, because of course, like a lot of your viewers, you have a lot of bikes over the years, and I suppose if I'm going back 17, 20 years now, you think, cool, what did I have back then? But yeah, I had quite a few over the years, and around that time would have been an early Hinckley Speed Triple, yeah.
Yeah. So what got you into the classic bike scene? Because with respect, you're probably a little bit younger than most of the VMCC members that I've met.
Yeah, I suppose when I was, again, like a lot of people, it's not unusual. I mean, a family member got me into sort of bikes, and I learned to ride on a CZ 175, would you believe? Awful thing. When I was about 13. It's a wonder it didn't put me off, really. And then the sort of interest progressed from there to the point where before I could actually ride on the road when I was 16, the first bike I restored when I was sort of 14, 15 on paper round money, as it was a 1948 Matchless G80. Did it in my bedroom at the old family home. My mum and dad were obviously very long suffering, but restored it terribly, of course. At that age, you don't know what you're doing. A bit like now, really. And then when I was sort of 16, again, like a lot of people, had a Yamaha Fizzer, little 50 FS1E, of course. And then when I was 17 and I passed my test, then I went that was my first Isle of Man TT, which I went on the Matchless, which promptly broke down. So I had sort of a grounding at quite an early age, really, when a lot of my mates had got sort of RD350 LCs and what have you, that sort of early 80s time. Very early on, I had a British bike, which was kind of crazy, and I soon learnt my lesson and got some reliable stuff as well, But it was only unreliable because I'd rebuilt it, to be fair. So that was really my grounding, yeah.
So I guess at the moment, in your job, you're kind of part of. Is there a better collection of old British bikes anywhere than?
No, it's I'm bound to say this, Steve, but of course it's the biggest, largest, greatest collection of British motorcycles in the world. It's the National Motorcycle Museum, but it's a very focused collection because it is British only. But being a focused collection like that is a great thing because it charts the history, if you like, of British motorcycle manufacture from when motorcycles, were virtually push bikes with engines, which is what they were, right through to today, where we've got bikes from Triumph at Hinckley. And so it charts that whole development of the British industry. And in being a focus collection, like we are, that's a great thing. It's a positive thing.
Yeah, and when I was there last time, I think what struck me was that it's the amount of innovation that went on. You know, I think we've lived through a generation of motorcycle development, you know, where bikes have changed a huge amount. You know, the way the chassis are built, the way the engines are built, the number of cylinders we have here, and we sort of think that we're the first to have done all this. But when you go and walk through that collection, there are people were having the same thoughts 100 years ago, and just
there's nothing
ways.
new under the sun. Sort of pseudo monoshock setups and everything else, and with our collection, as you know, Steve, it's laid out in quite a simple way in one respect, whereby you're not just charting the history of the British motorcycle industry, but you're charting the development of the motorcycle, so you can see year by year how things developed. And so you don't particularly have to have an interest in British bikes for any motorcyclist, whether they've got, you know, a brand new BMW S1000RR or a Ducati or a Japanese bike or whatever. If you're a motorcyclist, what you can see at the museum, where we've got nearly 1,000 machines in the collection, what you can see across those 5 huge halls that you've identified briefly there, you can see year by year how things developed. And so for any motorcyclist, whatever your particular interest or passion, it's a really good way, a simple way in one respect, of learning and seeing, not just learning from a book or on the internet, but seeing year by year, you know, 1898, 1899, 1900, and you'll know, Steve, that's what it's like. We've got one of something from almost every year, either really weird and wonderful individual makes or whole blocks of manufacturers like 65 BSAs and, you know, 50 Nortons and what have you. So not only can you chart that development of the motorcycle generally, but you can also chart the development year by year of particular manufacturers. So quite a simple format in a way, but I think all the better for being like that.
Yeah, and I love the fact you can see how the innovations developed. There's one really simple example. We were all watching on the news the other week. You know, the story of Captain Tom. You know, the guy who kind of did the walk around his garden to raise money for the NHS. And there's that picture that came out afterwards of him racing an old Scot
on his Scot, yeah.
And you look at that. I remember last time I was there at your place. I remember looking at and you look at that Scott side on, and you look at the way the engine's laid out and the angle of the cylinders and where the radiator is, and you look at that and you think, isn't that just a 1930s Yamaha LC?
Yeah, exactly. Like we said, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything's been done before. Yeah,
it's a really interesting and those Scots were. I think in their day it was a 600cc. Am I right? 2-stroke twin.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it's they're unusual things, the quirky things. Got a big following in the UK and the Scott Owners Club, but they can be like the TT replicas. They can be really quick little bikes. I mean, I've done some track stuff over the years. Things like more recently, things like Coupe Moto Lejeune. And a friend of mine's got a TT replica, and it's a really quick little thing. It would really surprise people when, you know, you can put modern tyres on. Would you believe? You get your rim sizes, you can put modern tyres on, and people would be surprised just how quick they can be.
Yeah. Okay. So how about you then, Chris? How do you get into all that? I guess having a dad that ran North Leicester Motorcycles probably helped.
Yeah, I was born into it. You know, my dad had the shop for 48 years. I just turned 40 last year, so I was born in a motorbike shop. I had little choice, really, did I? And so I grew up on Italian bikes because, weirdly, you see, we were all about Marini and Guzzi and stuff, and so my first bike at sort of 18 was a Marini 350 chassis with a 500 engine in it. And it's kind of weird because for the first sort of few years of my biking career, all I rode was Italian bikes, and obviously we got stacks of them. And then kind of after, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, I was sort of bored with Italian bikes. I thought, I'll buy a British bike, and the difference is quite striking. Then you see how much further ahead the Italians were in terms of brakes and handling and things like that, and oil tight and bits, that it was quite a shocking kind of jump,
Yeah, and Marini's always had that reputation, didn't they, for being, they've got a real kind of a real following, haven't they, and a real sort of reputation for being, punching above their weight, I guess. And
huge, yeah, and still now I think people kind of underestimate them, and nobody could understand when a Marini was brand new. It was £700, and an RD350 was £350. So it was twice the price of its kind of a Japanese equivalent, and people stood in the showrooms looking at them and couldn't really understand why. But now here we are, 35, 40 years later. That Marini's still on its original engine build. Everything still works perfectly. All the finishes are still good, and it's still an amazing little bike. Everything else is worn out. The Marini still stood strong, and I think we're beginning to understand where the money went now, because the quality in those little bikes was huge. The metals, the specification, the bits the components that they put into it was staggering for a little bike, really.
Yeah, and then am I right? They never made a what we'd call a big bike, did they?
Not until recent times when they built the big 1200 water-cooled thing. But yeah, 500 was the biggest capacity they ever made. And to be honest, the strange thing is now, I look at the modern bikes that they're producing with 200 brake horsepower and just think, well, what a pointless machine, because who needs that kind of power? You just don't, do you? You can't use it on the road. Most people can't use it on the track. What's the point in it? A Marini is actually technically all you need. It's enough power, isn't it? Sort of 40-odd brake horsepower will propel you to 90-odd miles an hour. If you're an idiot like me, you can scrape your knee on the floor. You can still do a track day. You can do whatever you like. You don't actually technically need anything more than that, do you?
No.
And I think I still love riding Marinis. I'm 6'2". I'm too big for them, but I still love riding them because you can go out and you can absolutely hold the throttle to the stop, give it everything it's got, and policemen wave at you and smile, as opposed to trying to arrest you and put you in jail. And it's the difference. You can have an awful lot of fun. Going fast on a slow bike, can't you?
Yeah, and they've got a really loyal following, haven't they? I think there's...
Yeah. It's for people that haven't been, they do a track day every year at Cadwell Park, usually in sort of July time, and you get a whole group full of Marinis. So there's 30-odd Marinis on track at the same time, and it really is the highlight of the year for a lot of people, including myself. It's just so much fun. Going out in a group full of the same bike almost, none of which have got any power, and just wringing its neck for lap after lap is lots and lots of fun. It's a great club and it's got a good following, like you say.
Yeah, that sounds great. So what, how do you? Both of you, I guess, in your day jobs, you see an awful lot of classic enthusiasts. What's the state of the classic scene at the moment? Is it thriving? Is it growing?
I think, interestingly, it's beginning to shift. I'm quite convinced this is a generational thing. The older British stuff that was big for a long time, like Vincent's and Bruff's and stuff like that, the people that were into those bikes are getting too old for it. And you're getting a younger generation like me who are coming in. And, of course, that's a different bunch of classics. There's still people that are into those machines. They're incredible bikes and they'll be around forever. But there's a shift now towards sort of 80s, 90s classics a lot more, and you're beginning to see the values of those bikes come up. And so I think the classic scene's evolving quite a lot, and changing. It's no longer just about sort of British bikes and older bikes. You're beginning to see things like the 916, 888s, RC30s, ZXR 750s, OW01s, all these sort of 80s and 90s icons, as well as slightly earlier stuff like Jotas and Guzzi Mark 1 Le Mans and things. They're now becoming big news, and the values keep going up and up and up, and they're interesting machines because they're very, very usable. You can jump on a Guzzi Mark 1 Le Mans and thunder down to the south of France just as easily as you can on an Africa Twin sat behind you there, Steve. And
and I guess a lot of the bikes that are there now, because I remember seeing this in the British scene. A lot of the bikes that were out there probably 20 or 30 years ago were needing a bit of attention and getting sort of sad. But now a lot of those bikes have been restored well, and people have spent some time and money on them. And actually, buying a Jota now is probably a better prospect than buying one 25 years ago, because it's had that time and money spent on it, making it lovely again. And in the same way as probably buying a 60s Bonneville now is probably better than buying a 60s Bonneville 20 years ago.
Yeah, a lot of them had some development and things going on, haven't they? Which they're better than they were when they were new. Some of them. Equally, there are some pretty awful ones out there too, and so you have to be quite careful because they're only as good as the people that have owned them. A lot of these machines, aren't they?
I know you guys have got a busy workshop there. How much of your time do you spend sort of fixing the horrors of the kind of wide-eye eBay buyers who've seen something and gone, I've got to have it, and then it turns up and perhaps isn't quite as good as they expected?
Probably 80-90% of what we do in the workshop is putting right what other people have done wrong in the past.
Really?
Yeah, it's a huge part of what we do. Most of these machines were good. There aren't many real donuts out there. A lot of people criticise sort of Italian electrics and things like that. But 90% of the time, I would say, when we get problems in the workshop, it's because somebody's been at it rather than something that the factory did 30 years ago. It's phenomenal the amount of stuff that we have to undo and put back to how it should be, which was working perfectly well in the first place.
Yeah.
It's interesting Chris says that, because I think this is one of the great myths about British bikes. One of the common myths that everybody's heard, that they're oily, they're unreliable, etc., etc. And a lot of people perhaps, they think about the youth when they started perhaps an apprenticeship back in the 50s or the 60s, and they have that perception that the bike broke down on the way to work and it was leaking oil and what have you. And of course, what they forget was, by the time they bought it, it was probably on its 8th owner, and those previous 7 owners had been mechanically very unsympathetic, running the thing on a shoestring. And so it's just like Chris said, quite often things, all right, you get exceptions with everything, with bikes, with washing machines, with cars, not so much these days, but certainly back then there's always exceptions. But generally there was really nothing wrong with the product, that for the most part, that was leaving the factory. It was just that they'd suffered a large number of very mechanically ill-educated people over the years that were maintaining the things on a shoestring. And of course people have this perception then that they were badly built and unreliable and leaked oil and would break down a lot. And that's not necessarily the case. But I mean, from the museum's point of view, as regards the classic scene generally, I mean, we're busier than we've ever been, and our visitor numbers have grown a lot over the last 5 years. I think that's partly, and again, echoing what Chris said, we see more and more people. When we talk about young people, we don't mean people in their early 20s, although obviously we get younger visitors. But when we talk about young people, quite often those people are in the 40s or 50s. Yeah. And maybe their parents, their dad had a bike, or they remember the bike in the garage, and then they've graduated onto the sort of the classics of the 70s and 80s. And we're getting a lot of those people through the museum now, what we would perhaps think of as younger people. And that's exactly where the market's shifting to a little bit. But for us, and I think for everybody in the classic industry, let's just use that term, it's about how we present things and how we engage with people. And you'll know, Steve, that we try to do some innovative things at the museum in terms of our membership scheme, where people can come and actually ride the bikes, which is unique in the world, really. Or when we do big events, even indoor events, to be fair, like Motorcycle Live at the NEC in November, we've got a live restoration where people can talk to the mechanics, our restoration team, and they'll restore a bike live at the show. Or twice a day we'll start up a couple of the race bikes, and so people can hear them. And it's about that hearing and smelling and seeing thing. It's that visceral thing almost, where it's about how we present things, and or maybe maybe not this July, certainly, because it's been cancelled, but we'll do the Goodwood Festival of Speed, and we'll take some of the most famous race bikes that we've got in the inventory, and we'll put Foggy on one, or we'll put McGuinness on one, or and we'll run those bikes up the track. And again, it's all about people hearing and seeing the things in a live setting. And so it's, I think, more and more, if we're going to engage with that younger audience, it's about doing it in a different way. It's, to a degree, it's about moving away from those sort of traditional static shows where something's sitting behind a barrier outside in a field or what have you, or in a display hall, and that's nice enough. There's nothing wrong with that. But does that really engage with people these days enough to fire their interest? And I would suggest it probably doesn't. And in the old job there at the Vintage Motorcycle Club, I mean, I ran an event called the Festival of 1,000 Bikes at Mallory Park. And again, that was all about old bikes on the track, but it wasn't just about old bikes on the track. The key to that was, it was like a sort of a super classic bike track day, but we'd encourage people with those bikes Chris was talking about, bikes from the 70s, 80s. We had sessions for them so they could come and enjoy themselves in a motorcycling atmosphere where everybody was into the same thing, play races for the weekend. But the key was introducing those people to the older bikes that they might not have had much perception about. Because why would they necessarily if their dad hadn't had one and they didn't remember anything about them, and that generational thing that was mentioned, people had sort of didn't really have much perception, or maybe were a bit frightened by them, almost thinking, oh, they're oily, they're unreliable, I don't know anything about them, I just want to take my bike to the dealership and get it fixed. That's obviously going to put a lot of people off. So this is why I think an example there being the Festival of 1,000 Bikes I was talking about, or what we do at the museum now. It's, for want of a better phrase, it's exposing people to the older machines, but in a live setting where they can talk to owners, where they can talk to people, where they can actually ride them. And that soon changes people's perceptions.
Yeah, the membership thing's really interesting, isn't it? Because that allows people who would never have a chance normally to ride some of those bikes to experience, a Brough or a Vincent or something perhaps maybe less aspirational but equally technically interesting.
Exactly. I mean, at the lower end, if you like, of what we offer there, our sort of classic bike days, it's just a question of paying the £30 a year membership and then basically paying a tiny bit towards the fuel and the insurance on the day, which is £15. So when you can come and ride, people usually get on 10 or 12 different bikes during the session, and they can range from 1930s hand change bikes, or as you say, through to some bikes that they could perhaps never normally even get to sit on, let alone ride. But that's important because it gives people that, it really introduces people to the older bikes in a way that we've got to do, but it introduces people to the older bikes in a way that really engages with them.
Yeah.
Do you know, I've got a great little story that kind of follows on from this. A few months ago, I had a genuine Egley Vincent, a Fritz Egley built machine, it's beautiful. And I was contacted by an agent of a current Formula One driver, who will remain nameless for this. And we want to buy this bike. Yeah, our guy wants to be able to ride it around London. He's got his house in London, and he'd obviously seen something like it in a Belstaff advert and thought it was going to make him look cool. And so I said, okay, right, it's an interesting bike to try and start and stuff. I said, maybe what we need to do is put you an electric start conversion on to give you a chance, because he's about 7 stone wet through, this fella. And so So we put a Grosse electric start on it, we put a multi-plate clutch on it, we put electronic ignition and tried to kind of make it as easy as possible. Anyway, the big day came. I went down to London. It's a house around the back of Harrods. This is pretty high-end stuff. And so I get it out of the van, right, here's the bike, here's the electric start, boom, because they start beautifully on a Grosse, a Vincent does if it's done right. I says, but if you need to kickstart it, here's what you have to do. And so, of course, top dead 1, top dead 2, decompressor, ticklers, And I may as well have been speaking Japanese, right? You've never seen more blank-looking faces in your entire life than there was for these couple of guys. So they fetch out the drivers and the maid and the bits, and they go, all right, everybody's got to watch it. And they're all at a line of around 7 people videoing me, demonstrating how to start a Vincent with the kickstart, because it was Japanese to them. They didn't know. Nobody knew what a valve lifter was or a decompressor. Nobody knew what a tickler was. Nobody knew what top dead compression was. It's just. And I was there for about 2 hours trying to get them to understand how to start it. And I bet to this day nobody's ridden it. But that just shows you how much things have changed, and the lack of education and things with these older bikes into the younger kids now. And this is a technical person, This is a racing car driver, and didn't have a clue. Not a clue.
It's fun. I had limited experiences, but I had a similar thing when I was working on a classic bike magazine and we were riding Gold Stars, and I sort of I started in an era where we used to kickstart bikes, and probably the first 5 years I was riding, most of the bikes I rode had kickstarts, but we had this great idea to ride Gold Stars into the middle of Brighton on Bank Holiday weekend, and go to the beach and take pictures. And of course, Gold Star, it stalled at every single set of lights, and I couldn't restart it. So the guy I was riding with, who's a guy, I can't remember his name now, he's from a classic bike shop not far from Brighton, and he was probably 30 years older than me, so he's probably getting, at that point he was probably in his 70s. And so he was having to get off at every set of lights and start my bike for me, and and it's just embarrassing. But I just had nothing but admiration for him, because he could do it every time, first kick every single time, and I couldn't even get close. And you just realise it. But it's part of the experience, isn't it? I think that's the thing. It's what makes those bikes so appealing, because it is so different, and it's.
We've all been there, Steve.
I'm glad it wasn't just me.
We just best try and hide your failings, you see.
Well, luckily for me, my dad had quite a few Vincents, and we used to go out riding together. So I've ridden lots of Vincents, and I know them quite well, and so I learnt through that, and looking in the hedgerow for the bits that had fallen off and stuff. Fond memory.
It's an interesting idea, because you were saying earlier, Chris, I think this thing is, as the classic generations move, and now let's say there's a lot more interest now in the kind of 70s and 80s bikes, and even some of the 90s bikes than there were, and it makes you want to, because bikes like Vincents and Bruffs there's always going to be a demand, there's always going to be an affection for those kind of bikes. But it'll be interesting to see whether, as the generations progress, whether the demand for some of the, I guess, the kind of more run-of-the-mill British bikes falls away, and that demand for the top-end stuff stays, and whether it just, whether from a kind of an investment and a buying and a collecting point of view, whether that changes, and whether the prices of some of those bikes, those old British bikes that have gone up a bit, start to come down again.
So it's already happening, I'd say.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I see it as a dealer. What sells, what doesn't sell, what I can get the money for and stuff. The problem is you can advertise anything for anything, and so you open up the magazines and you see bikes being advertised for X amount, but the reality is they're probably not selling for that anymore. I've got through last year I think I sold 6 or 7 Vincents. And there was a time when you could sell a Vincent in 24 hours, and people were fighting over it. Not anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Times have changed a lot. It took me a little while to sell some of those bikes, and you were having to work hard to get the money for them. And it's definitely shifting. the balance is shifting. You know, people aren't so keen to throw money into those older bikes anymore. Whereas if I get a good 916 now or something, or an RC30, let's say, I can sell it stood on my head, and that's the difference, you know.
So the next question, I guess the interesting thing is, how do you know what a good 916 is or a good RC30? I remember I bought an RC30 20 years ago, and luckily I had a guy called Bob Soloway, who was running the RC30 club at the time, helped me and gave me a lot of advice on how to spot a good one. But I remember even then I looked at probably 7 or 8 before I bought the one, and you have to get very close with those before you see it. And I guess when you're spending the kind of money you're spending these days, even more so.
It's fairly straightforward. It's the same with any bike, really. Ideally, you want a UK machine, and you want history that allows you to verify the mileage all the way through. So it's got to have old MOTs, it's got to have old receipts, it's got to have bits and bobs like that, you know, just to show that the mileage is what it is and that it hasn't been raced. And there's a couple of things you can do. Look at the lock stops underneath the bottom there. If they've been raced, they tend to have been drilled and tapped. People put a bolt in to shorten up the lock stop, and that's just a kind of clue. And obviously just have a really good look at it. Look for any scrapes, look for any possible damage, look for any lock wiring, look for things like that. Because a lot of those bikes ended up as race bikes because they were really good at racing.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of the ones that were raced probably have now been back on the road or could have been back on the road for 20 or 30 years. So actually, a lot of those modifications for racing may well have been removed by now.
Yeah, but you can still, you know, have a good look at the sump plug to see if it's drilled. Look at the lock stops. Look at the bits. You know, you just have to be careful. And if you're not sure, take somebody with you. Have a good look at it. I think the RC30 Owners Club have got a guy, an expert, who will go and inspect a bike for you. He charges a fee, but funnily enough, I sold an RC30 last year, and he came and inspected it on behalf of the buyer. I was happy for him to do that, which any decent dealer should be. And he gave it a clean bill of health, and the guy bought it. I think that's always a smart way of doing it. I think he charges a couple of £100. Well, if you're spending 30-odd £1,000, it's probably a worthwhile investment, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess. Because I guess the other thing would be that on a bike that old now, you might get some kind of service history, but it's probably unusual to get a complete service history on a 30-year-old bike.
Absolutely, yeah. I get 4 or 5 phone calls a week on older bikes that I got advertised, you know, and this could be, like, I've just sold a Dharma, you know, that's now 35, 40 years old, and I must have had 5 phone calls. Has it got full service history? Does it have its toolkit? Does it, you know, how many owners has it had? How many? And people's expectations are huge, and of course the reality is often quite different. But you've just got to do what you can and use your head. I always kind of look at the bike on face value, look for wear on the switchgear, look for wear on the footrests, look for sort of gear change lever, toe pedals, bits and bobs, and you can see if a bike's done a lot of mileage, you'll actually see wear on these things. And I've seen bikes that you could see had done 100,000 miles plus and that have got sort of 15 on the clock. Just use your head, be smart.
Yeah, and I guess in a lot of cases, actually, a high mileage bike isn't necessarily a bad thing, is it? If it's been looked after, and a low mileage bike can be a lot worse. No disrespect to James, but some of my worst nightmares are when people come to me and go, "I've bought this bike. It's been in a museum for 20 years. It's beautiful. It's immaculate. It's amazing." And every seal will be dried out. The carburetors will be crusted inside. You know, all the wiring's corroded and gone dry.
We use our bikes, Chris.
Yeah, I know you do, mate. I know. But, you know, I've had this quite a lot where people have bought bikes in from Italy or bought bikes from here or bought bikes from there, and they always sell me this great story that it's not going to need anything because it's been in a museum for 30 years or it's been in a collection for 30 years. And they're the worst bikes ever because everything's completely dried out, perished. sludged, blocked, tanks gone rusty inside. They look lovely, but mechanically they're an absolute nightmare.
Yeah. And I guess that's it. I mean, sorry, James, that's an interesting challenge. You think the number of bikes you've got at the National Motorcycle Museum, keeping them all in a reasonable state, must be
Yeah, I mean, obviously with the amount of inventory we've got, Steve, it's just it's physically impossible to keep them all in running order all the time, because of the membership scheme and what have you. And we're saying about the race bikes, that's Hall 5 of the museum, which is all competition bikes. We do run a lot of the bikes at events, whether it's our own events or third-party events, like Goodwood or Motorcycle Live, or different events. But it is impossible to keep everything running. Everything pretty much in the collection was restored to run. But as Chris said, you do have to store things very carefully, and even then, things can take some recommissioning, especially in terms of two-strokes where seals and whatever you can dry out. So it's always a challenge. I mean, we've got 3 normally when everybody's not at home, but we've got 3 full-time restorers, a restoration team, and actually they're all one family. It's quite an interesting story. It's there's the grandfather, the son, and the grandson, if you like, and Colin, the grandfather, if you like, he's in his late 70s now, and he worked for Roy Richards, the founder of the museum, from before, when there was a museum, on Roy's private collection, which formed the basis going back to the late 1970s. That formed the original basis of the collection. And so Colin worked for Roy before there was a museum, and now we've got 3 generations of that family as our restorers and mechanics, which is nice, because it's still very much a family affair, and that's quite rare these days. A lot of the members of staff there at the museum have been there almost generations now, and in today's workplace that's quite unusual, and it's a nice thing. It's a family business still, with families involved, as big as it is. But even with those 3 guys working full time, things still take some keeping on top of, especially with the amount of bikes that we've got.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's a lot. So given the fact that you guys spend your working lives surrounded by the most fantastic collections of motorcycles, I got 2 questions, I guess. What's the dream bike? What's the bike you still haven't got that you want to buy one day? Another one, I guess, was, what was the last bike you bought for yourself?
It's the same answer for me, funnily enough, and Chris will like this. Like a lot of people, a lot of viewers to Bike Social, they'll have had a lot of bikes over the years, and they'll have lost count, and so I'm not unusual in that. And if you sit down and try and think, it's hard to think back now over the years at exactly everything that you've had, and you think, cool, have I forgotten anything? But most things you sort of buy and sell, don't you? And you have fun with it for a year or a couple of years or whatever, and then you move on. But one bike I always regretted selling, and I had it back in the early 90s. I had it nearly new. Was Chris, get this, Ducati 851, and I always regretted selling that bike. But one of the few bikes I really regretted selling. So. One of my dream bikes to get back in the garage was a mint low mileage 851 Ducati, which I did buy at the end of last year. And so one of my dream bikes would have been that. And funnily enough, I've bought one, so I'm sort of doing the middle age thing and going back to my youth, And also, I mean, we all have bikes that we aspire to, and the other one's a British bike, as you might expect. But going back to sort of when I was 16 and riding around on that FS1E and going to pick up bits for that Maxless I restored, there was a British bike breaker out near East Midlands Airport, near Castle Donington, long since gone. The name, it was called View Taste, and I think that might mean something to a few people, but the name's fairly meaningless now, lost in the mist of time. But I always remember that I turned up there one day, and they had a lineup of, he must have perhaps imported them back from America, I don't know. He had a lineup of Mark II Royal Enfield Interceptors, 750 Interceptors, with the chrome peanut tank, and they were one of the best styled bikes of the 60s and early 70s, and a bit of a under the radar for a lot of people, a lot of classic bike enthusiasts that recognise Bonnevilles or Commandos or what have you, because those Mark II Interceptors, most went for export to America, and they only really made them for 2 or 3 years. And I always remember that, and it stuck in my mind, these fantastic looking bikes. And anybody wants to see how fantastic they are, and they don't know what I'm talking about, Google Mark II Royal Enfield Interceptor 750. We're not talking about the modern Interceptors, the 650s made in India, nice worthy bikes that they are, but we're talking about the original 750 Interceptors, the last ones. And I always wanted one of those, and I've got one of those as well. And so it's the same question really, Steve, the two bikes that you aspire to having, the dream bikes if you like, and the bikes that you've actually got, and it's one and the same for me, luckily now.
That's lucky. How about you, Chris?
I similar stuff to James actually. I'm a big fan of AAA 851 Ducatis and early 916 Ducatis, and in particular I still race competitively. I've not learnt yet, and I'm heavily into race bikes. So I mean, behind me you can see I've got some factory sort of Ducati RS racing machines, some 955s and 996 RSs and things like that. And they're very much sort of some of the dream machines for me. And I've got a thing for two-stroke race bikes as well, GP bikes. And so I've got I had an RG500, a late one, which I raced competitively, and I really loved that bike, and kind of regret selling it. And so I've promised myself I'm going to replace it with one of the Suitors. The Suitor two-stroke GP machines, because it's kind of the newest, latest and best 500 two-stroke that you can buy. And I want to race a Suitor. It's absolutely mental, but I'm determined in the next few years to buy one of those new Suitors and race it in sort of open class or something.
Is that the one with? Is that an engine that they developed for sidecar racing? I remember that.
I don't think so. No, not particularly. It's something. I'm not sure where the engine came from, quite frankly. But obviously, Suter make the Moto 2 bikes and the swinging arms and the bits and bobs, and I love big two strokes. And I had I had a kind of Mark 13. RG, which is the one with the exhaust valve on and stuff, and it was an ex-Paget's machine, and to ride a big two-stroke on a track, and to win races and to take the checkered flag on a 500 GP bike is something that as a kind of aspiring club racer I can probably call myself, that's something special to do, you know, and so I'd like a bit more of that. And so it'd have to be a Suitor, and so aside from that, Ducatis, 916 888s, bits. I've got a couple of TZs and things as well, but I'm a bit big for a TZ 350.
I think last time I was at your place, you had a TZ powered bimotor, didn't you? Which I'd never seen before.
YB1, yeah. It's in fact, as it happens, it's sat just there. Look at that. At the top of the stairs. I've actually sold that. That's going to Australia to a collector, and we're just waiting for kind of lockdown to lift a little bit, and that's going to get crated up and shipped out to Australia. So
when you're buying this bike, if you want to buy a 955 RS Ducati, presumably that's very much about who you know, and they don't just pop up for sale on eBay, do they? Or do they?
No, yes and no. I mean, I've got a line of them here, so if you want one, just call me. It's quite a small scene. It's quite interesting. A lot of Ducati enthusiasts, a lot of people don't understand what an RS Ducati is or a Corsa Ducati is. Every year the factory produces a handful of customer race bikes, which you can go along and buy. And so like British Superbike teams or Italian Superbike teams, places like German Superbike teams, they can go to the factory and they can buy a full-up Superbike, and it's usually kind of last year's factory bike, if you know what I mean. So I've got a 95 sat behind me. That was basically Fogarty's 94 bike. Okay, and they're incredible machines because it's silhouette formula. So it looks like a 916, but when you get into it, almost every single component on there is different. You know, it's like the swinging arm's 20mm longer. It doesn't look different by the eye, but it's 20mm longer. The radiator's got an extra run on it. Looks like a 916 radiator, but it's just slightly bigger. The oil cooler's got an extra run on it. You know, the airbox is slightly bigger, the throttle body is slightly bigger, and you know, obviously all the engine internals are different. The forks sit wider in the yokes. They're what they call a wide track, you know. The brakes are different, the forks themselves are different, back shock's different, but it all looks at a glance like a 916. But almost every single component on there is different, and I find them really interesting because Ducati make like 20 or 30 of them a year, and so if you get one with a frame number on, and it's recognised by the factory as an RS or a Corsa, then you've got something extremely special. I suppose the nearest thing that people will understand is perhaps a Black Lightning Vincent. You know. It was a customer race bike. You could buy it from the factory and go racing and be competitive. I find them fascinating machines. They're beautiful. And I think a lot of people don't understand how special they are. And they're my big tip for the top in terms of if you want to make money out of classic bikes, buy an RS Ducati, because if a Black Lightning is anything to go by, we will see these go for huge money in the future, just because of the rarity of them.
And is it the case with bikes like that then that so they get, you know, they race at the top level one year and then they get sold to another team the following year who probably aren't a factory team but are, you know, or aren't support, and then gradually over the next 3 or 4 years they kind of get sold through the paddock to various teams, and I guess they become slightly less competitive every year because things advance. So is there a sort of a sweet spot then? Is there a moment where they cease to be competitive race bikes but they're not yet classics, where a savvy collector will go in and say this is the time to buy?
100%, yeah. You know, when a race bike's 4 or 5 years old, it's worth next to nothing. You know, that's a good time to buy. With the Ducatis, not so much, because Ducati's got such a huge following for the brand.
Yeah.
And there's so many enthusiasts and collectors out there that they tend to hold the value quite well. And a lot of the time the bikes get broken for parts because you can often fit a lot of the race parts to your road bike. So you can get Shaky's old exhaust system or something and bolt it onto your road going bike, you know, or these footrests or those bits or that radiator, and so they can often get stripped.
Yeah, so I guess with every year, kind of the provenance of a particular race bike sort of gets diluted, doesn't it? Because there's less of the original bike on there.
Yeah, and equally you have to take it with all the pinch of salt, because race bikes are very much sort of Trigger's broom, aren't they? You know, it's had 4 new handles and 3 new heads. They get rebuilt through the year, and when you're running at top end, they'll have so many engines, so many frames. I mean, I've got one of Carlos Checa's bikes, and I've got set of wheels number 18. Okay. just the wheels are labelled CC for Carlos Checa and then number 18, right? So it's the 18th set of wheels that you've got there, which just kind of puts it into perspective a little bit when you're running something like World Superbikes at top level. They're changing wheels so often, they're changing tyres, they've got so many different choices, they're in and out, that they've got as many as sort of 18, 20 sets of wheels for one rider.
Well, yeah, it puts it in perspective, doesn't it?
And obviously Carlos was fond of a good crash as well, as we all know. And so how many frames and stuff he got through during the year, I've no idea. Mine certainly got plenty of gravel rash down the side of it where he's tested its capabilities.
Yeah, those Ducatis are your kind of tip for investment. How about you then, James? From what you see on a day-to-day basis, what would you recommend if someone...
Well, I tell you what, and this is at the other end, so, for more the sort of money that a lot of viewers would want to spend or have to spend, and you heard it here first, early Hinckley Triumph triples, Tridents, Daytona'S, those early 3-cylinder bikes, yeah? Especially those early Tridents. Still very cheap to buy. I would recommend buying an original one with good mileage. There's plenty about. Quite a lot have been really well looked after because they were the sort of owners that bought them. The 900 particularly. 900 Hinckley Triumph triples, J-Reg, K-Reg, those first bikes, the first production, 1992, 1993, British Racing Green, those sort of colours. Still very much under the radar. A lot have been, used. They've got different exhausts on. They've been modified, blinged up a little bit. Get an original one. You're going to have to sit on it for a while, but 10, 15 years time, they'll be a good investment. They will. Nice bike as well. So early 3-cylinder Triumph, Hinckley Triumphs, 92, 93, the first 2 or 3 years of production. So much so, I've got one.
Funny that.
Yeah, as it happens.
I love a good 3-cylinder, and I think those early Hinckley motors were good.
They're great bikes. Nicely well made, lovely characterful engine, go well. As well as you need anything to go in some circumstances. Decent tyre sizes, decent rims, good brakes, perfectly acceptable bike to ride even all these years later. But and loads of character, beautiful engine. Those triples, one of my favourite engines.
Do you know, a couple of years ago, I took one of the slightly later speed triples in the Bug Eyes 595 lime green street speed triple, and I took it in part exchange. I gave £1,500 for it as a part X, okay, and it was immaculate. And I thought, I'm going to ride this for a bit. And bear in mind, you see some of the bikes I've got here, it's sort of best part of 100 grand, some of these things. And I rode round on this £1,500 speed triple all summer. I went to work and back on it every day. I went up and did the Snake Pass. I went out with my dad. I went here. I went there. I went in it. I was doing the shopping on it. I was doing it. And I rode it and rode it and rode it and rode it. And I loved it because it's all you need for the road, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think they have gone under the radar a little bit. But so much fun. And the early bikes especially will be a really good investment.
Yeah.
They're great bikes, aren't they? For no money at the minute as well.
Yeah, for no money, and for people that haven't ridden one, I would recommend it if you could. If you've got a mate with one or a mate of a mate with one, have a go, because it's and if you're not looking to spend a lot of money, hell of a lot of bike for the money still, hell of a lot of bike, and that won't last. In like I say, it's not going to be an immediate thing, but while prices are like they are, absolute. That's my tip if you're asking, Steve. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, isn't it? Because I think when those bikes were launched, a lot of us were still very focused on sports bikes and fairings and getting our knee down, and they went under the radar a little bit. But actually, the way motorcycling is these days, there's a lot more interest in those kind of bikes anyway, aren't there? And I know a lot of them. Funny, I know a lot of those early ones kind of ended up being converted into sort of speed triple lookalikes, didn't they?
Or cafe racers, or that's right, the early speed triple, they did, that's exactly right, yeah. So get an original one, especially with the original exhaust. Motard, do you remember Motard? Of course, finished now, but Motard made the exhaust for Triumph back in the day. They were very, very nicely made. The chrome and everything was very, very high quality, but you just can't get them now, and they're a fortune on eBay if you ever see them. So try and buy a bike with the original exhaust, and that's one of the keys, because you just can't get them. They're hen's teeth now, and of course we're not talking a classic bike going back sort of 50 or 60 years. We're talking a relatively new bike in one respect, but that's one thing that is just getting very, very difficult to get. You can't get them from Triumph now. It's an eBay job, and they are a fortune. So if I did have a recommendation, it's buy one that hasn't had a 3-into-1 stuck on it. Buy one with the original Motard exhaust.
Yeah. So I was going to say the other question was, what's of the bikes you've got either in your shop, showroom, in the museum? And this might be an insensitive question, bearing in mind what happened at the museum a few years ago. But I would say if there's one bike that you had to take home, if something disastrous happened and there's one bike you had to rush in and save and take home, what would it be?
I think my favourite bike in the museum, and it's a lot of bikes that people will know about, is the Norton Rotary, the white Charger, the 1992 Steve Hislop Senior TT winning bike. Such a history, such a provenance. Imagine that after all those years, and for anybody that doesn't know, most motorcyclists one way or another know this story, but against the might of Yamaha, the factory, and Foggy on the Yam there, and a bike virtually built in a shed on a budget from a factory that was due to finish again. Of course, Norton's had a bit of a checkered history, as we know, over the years, but going back to the early 90s then, that sort of relatively successful incarnation of the factory for a while was getting towards the finish, and a bike built on a shoestring, the first British bike to win a TT since the early 70s, after all those years, and what a story. And I have been privileged, and I am very, very privileged to have ridden that bike a few times at different events, because people love to see it at Goodwood and what have you, and such a privilege, and that would be the bike. We're so lucky to have that in the museum, and of course, as you probably know, Steve, we've got all the X-Works Rotaries, Aslam's bike, Robert Dunlop's bikes, the famous Trevor Nation and Steve Spray bikes. You know, a lot of bike social viewers all have seen that poster from Motorcycle News all that years ago when Spray and Nation are got the front ends up in unison, and we've got all those bikes, and they're bikes that we do tend to run quite a lot at events, but for me it would be absolutely the white Charger. I
get that. How about you, Chris?
Weirdly, it's another Hislop bike. Just about here, where I'm trying to point at it, there's the 1995 British Superbike title-winning Ducati that Hislop rode. It's the Devimede Ducati, a 955 RS sort of Corsa. It's a factory bike, and of course that was back in the day when they didn't have a million sets of wheels and engines and bits. You know that is the bike still with its number and with its history file and its setup data and its bits, and so that's a nice thing. And just here as well, I've got one of Sean Emmett's bikes, one of the Red Bull Ducatis as well, which is it'd be a tough choice which one to drag out the shop if it was on fire. And weirdly, down the front of the shop, I've got a pile of bits, which is a 1991 Ducati 888 Superbike Corsa that belonged to Steve Wynn Sports Motorcycles, and they prepared that for Fogarty to ride in '92 at the Isle of Man. And at the last minute, he did a dirty on them and switched to the Loctite Yamaha and went on to fight with Hislop on the white Charger that you were talking about. So I've got kind of part of that story too. Sat in pieces down the front of the shop there.
Wow.
Well, that's the funny thing about that race, because of course Foggy said that the Yamaha there, fantastic bike of course, was falling to bits underneath him, and the Norton built in virtually in a shed on no budget was virtually faultless. So something that was a lot of people might not have expected. You might have thought that would have been swapped around, but yeah.
Final question to both of you: what's your kind of favourite classic tale? That you can repeat at least.
Oh, okay. It drags on a bit, so I shall condense it. So, going back to the Festival of 1,000 Bikes and the old job that I mentioned, that became a huge deal. It was one of the biggest classic track days in Europe. It became, and we always had a headline act, if you like. So we had foggy ride. It was about the first time he'd come back to the track in about 2010 to 2009. I forget exactly now. And we had Wayne Gardner and we had Freddie Spencer. So we always had that sort of mixture of stars on their original bikes if we could. And that was a big part of the event, and that's what drew the big crowds. But there was one person I really wanted, and that was Kenny Roberts, because Kenny, since he'd retired from running a team, he really hadn't done much. He hadn't made any personal appearances and certainly not done any track stuff. And as he said to me, and I won't, Kenny's is one for the colourful language, but as he said to me, you know, I've spent my lifetime on a plane. I don't want to spend any more time on a plane. So anyway, to condense the story down, I tried to get him and email, and he was useless on email and what have you. And eventually I said to him, look, if I come over to, this was the start of 2011, if I come over and see you and tell you about the event, you know, would you be at least prepared to talk to me? And he said, basically, again, cutting out the colourful language, if you're stupid enough to fly halfway across the world for me to refuse you face to face, then you're stupid enough to do it. You do what you like. So I managed to get this meeting with him. I wondered if he was even going to be there. So flew to San Francisco, because this was a big deal, getting Kenny. Flew to San Francisco, hired a car, drove up to Modesto, to his famous ranch, you know, where all the riders over the years from Rainey and Kaczynski and what have you, where he's got his motocross course and his dirt track and his training facilities there. And it's kind of it is a ranch, and there's quite a lot of land there, and he's got his track, and he's got a couple of barns with all his old bikes in. Anyway, it was December, just before Christmas, and this is an important part of the story. So I'd never met him. Goes to his place, and he's a dry devil, very, very dry, and bit sarcastic, really. But anyway, I ended up being there about 3/4 of a day, and he could see I was enthusiastic and genuine. And I'd got some sponsorship off Michelin at the time, so I could offer him decent money to come. It wasn't a sort of a shoestring effort. And on the way out at Heathrow, because I know from people that knew him, he likes a drink, Kenny. And he likes whiskey, so I'd bought him a nice bottle of single malt. I'd left it in the car, and gone to meet him, and it was great because he showed me in the barns towards the end of the day, and the KR race team bikes and all the things he developed, and he got some of his old TZs from back in the day and loads of bikes. Amazing, absolutely amazing experience. And he really sort of warmed up a bit towards the end of the day, and he was a bit less cold, if you like, because he could see I was genuine, and I had made him a good offer. And he said that. He said, I respect the offer you've made me, because he said, a lot of people try and lowball me. That's a really good offer. But he said, I'm still going to say no. I really don't want to do it, but it's a good offer. And then we spent a little bit more time talking, and he did warm up a bit, and he said, well, look, he said, you've not lowballed me. You've come all this way. I'll think about it. And I thought, well, he's not going to say yeah, he's just trying to get rid of me. But hey, I'd had a great day, and I'd done my best. So goes back to the leaves him, shakes hand, leaves on really friendly terms. I don't think either of us had had a bad day in the end, and went back to the car, realising that this bottle of whiskey was still on the back seat of the car. Now, as you know, Steve, I like a drink, but whiskey's not really my thing. And so I thought, well, I'm not taking that all the way back to Derbyshire, where I live. I'll take it back up. So gets the whiskey, walks back up to the door, knocks on the door. Kenny comes to the door. I said, oh, Kenny, I said, I know you like a drink. I said, so do I. But I said, whiskey's not really my thing. Happy Christmas. Just before Christmas, gave him the whiskey. Job done. Goes back to the iCar, goes back to San Francisco, gets on a plane, comes home. Doesn't hear anything for a month, and I thought he's not going to contact me. And then towards the end of January, a good month later, probably over a month, January 2011 that would have been, email out the blue, yep, I'll do it, send me the details. Couldn't believe it, absolutely couldn't believe it, because he'd done nothing really. And And anyway, that was great. And he came, and it was a massive event, and it was the biggest sort of crowd since the Cooper Agostini race back in the early 70s. People lining the grass banking and what have you over the start finish straight. Really amazing. Very emotional day for me, because it was such a huge crowd and people had a fantastic time. The weather was great. It was just one of those great moments in your sort of working life. And towards the end of the day, I asked him and I said, Kenny, you really weren't going to come. I said, and he'd enjoyed himself and all the crowds had been flocking around him and he'd loved it. And I said, Kenny, you weren't going to come. Why did you come? And he said, no, I wasn't. He said, it's the fact that I'd said no to you and you still came back and bought me that bottle of whiskey. And so it was just that stupid 40 quid bottle of whiskey. All the money I'd offered him didn't mean a thing to him. Really didn't want to do it. It was the fact that I'd bothered, when I'd forgotten it, to take it back up to his door and say, Kenny, happy Christmas, forgot to give you this. And it was that stupid 40 quid bottle of whiskey. So it just shows you.
Means more than a few grand to somebody like that, doesn't it?
Yeah, and people talk these days about, and especially at the moment, about how things will change after lockdown and not having face-to-face meetings and not going to see people, and we can do everything like on Zoom like we're doing now and what have you. And you know what? I don't believe it. I don't believe it for a minute. And that's a perfect example how seeing somebody and sitting down with them and trying to build a bit of a relationship, you'll never replace that. And the world will be poorer for it if we forget that, because it can make the difference. Not always. Things like this can be dead convenient, and it's brilliant that we can do this. But I think people will forget at their cost how important that sitting down, having a cup of coffee face-to-face thing can be. And that was a perfect example of that, because you would absolutely not have done it otherwise.
Yeah, what a great story. Go on then, Chris, top that.
Well, I'm not sure I can top that, can I? I suppose a few years ago I was doing the Dijon Coupes Moto Legend, which James said he's been to as well. It's a lovely event, and it was red hot, and I was riding a Bimota that had raced in World Superbikes and bits and bobs like that. Anyway, in the next garage was Phil Reed and some guys, and one afternoon we were sort of getting ready to go out, and he was in the same session as I was. And I'm not a huge Reedy fan, but lots of people are. Anyway, he's about finished these days. If you don't know, he's not in great health, and we had to help him into his leathers, literally. And by the time he got into his leathers and zipped up, he was, and somebody held a cigarette to his mouth for him, like this, and he went, okay, right, I'm good. And they lifted him onto this RG500, and it was one of the old kind of Widowmaker RG500s, one of the early ones, like a Mark II or something. And I was thinking to myself, Christ, how's this going to work? Because he could barely put one foot in front of the other. Anyway, I followed him out of the pit lane, and I sat behind him for a few laps. And I could not believe how smooth and how fast he could still ride. And you as a racer, as a club racer, you look at him and thought, well, it's no wonder he won so many world championships, because he never missed an apex or a gear or a marker or anything. He was silky smooth and fast, like he would still hold his own in the fast group on a track day, fast. And I had a lot of respect for him after that. Didn't have a lot for him before, but I certainly had a lot afterwards, because there's a man who can still ride a motorcycle even though he's struggling to walk just about, and lovely to see, really lovely to see. I overtook him and cleared off because I could, but it was lovely to watch a master at work for a little bit.
Oh, that's great. What a lovely story. That's fantastic. Listen, guys, I think we'll probably call it a day there, because we've been nattering for ages. I could go on for ages and ages and ages, but we can't use all the bandwidth in the world, so I suppose we should call it. Thanks for your time. Really appreciate that. Thanks again to our sponsors, Avas Security, and this will be part of the virtual classic bike show that is going on this weekend. I hope you all enjoy that. Thanks again, and see you soon, hopefully.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
he's trying to make himself look intelligent now and show us all the books up.
With this, which doesn't belong to me, and this, which doesn't belong to me.
It's 2 wheels, keeping it real.
Yeah, well, this thing, I mean, I'm just under 6 foot, and I have to, when I've got all my winter kit on, I actually, you know, I have to kind of lift my leg.
Is that controversial enough for you? I've learnt my lines off your questions. You're going to throw me now.
Oh, you spent all weekend writing out your answers, haven't you?
Well, about 10 minutes ago, yeah.